In today's video, we'll examine 3 cold cases that were solved in the 1980s. But before we head back to the 1980s, I want to recommend a great documentary that I saw on Magellan TV, who is the sponsor of this video. The documentary is called Crossbow Killer, and it's about a bizarre murder that happened in 1992 in Cape Town, South Africa. The documentary starts off with the discovery of a bloated, unidentified body floating in a river, and then it tells the story of an amazing advancement in forensic science and unravels a disturbing mystery. Crossbow Killer is just one of the many fantastic documentaries you can find on Magellan TV. I also really enjoy their historical documentaries about history's most notorious people. A documentary I found interesting but disturbing was Göring's Secret, the story of Hitler's Marshal. It is about Hermann Göring, who was the architect for some of the Nazis' most evil plans. There is so much more to discover on Magellan TV, which is run by filmmakers. New documentaries are being added all the time, and they are ad-free. Magellan TV can be watched anywhere, at any time, on your TV, laptop, or mobile device. You can also cast from your phone to your TV. It works with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, iOS, Google Play, and so many more. Magellan TV has a special offer for criminally listed viewers. Just go to try.magellantv.com/criminally-listed and you'll get a month for free. Please help support Criminally Listed and get access to over 2,000 documentaries by checking out Magellan TV. Number 3. Marion Monroe. In August 1980, the police in Weberville, Michigan received an unusual letter. It was from a 78-year-old woman who was living in a nursing home in Eaton Rapids, Michigan. The woman's identity has never been made public. She wrote that she had been living with a horrible secret for over 5 decades. Lately, because of the secret, she had been having horrible nightmares. She said that over 50 years earlier, her ex-husband, Russell Smith, killed a couple. She wrote that she thought that the couple's name was Monroe and they lived in Weberville. She also thought that the couple was well-to-do. The police in Weberville were not aware of a murder of that nature, so they passed the letter along to the state police. The state police did an investigation and they learned that in 1926, a couple with the last name Monroe was attacked at their farmhouse just outside of Fowlerville, Michigan. Fowlerville is about 5 miles from Weberville. 54-year-old Arthur Monroe lived on a farm with his 52-year-old wife, Marion. In early June 1926, they sold their farm for $17,000. Accounting for inflation, that was about $250,000. Even though they had sold the farm on June 10th, they were still living on the farm. On the morning of June 11th, a farmhand arrived and found Arthur on the ground between the house and the garage. He had been struck in the head multiple times. He was alive but unconscious. It appeared he had been attacked as he was carrying bags of groceries from his truck to the house. The farmhand went and got help. When he returned with his friend, they picked up Arthur and carried him to the master bedroom. That's when they made a horrifying discovery. 52-year-old Marion was in bed, and it was clear she was dead. Like her husband, she had been beaten in the head. Arthur was taken to the hospital, and a couple days later, he regained consciousness. At first, he didn't recognize his daughters or his brother. After some time, some of Arthur's memories came back to him, but he did not remember the night of the attack. Arthur lived for another 21 years, but he was never able to recall what happened that evening. The police theorized that the motive behind the attacks was robbery. They thought that the killer assumed that the $17,000 from the sale of the farm was in the house. But the money had been deposited in the bank shortly after the Monroes received it. so the killer only got $30 to $40 and the Monroes' watches. In 1980, after the state police figured out what crime the author of the letter was talking about, they talked to the author of the letter. She explained that at the time of the murder, she was living with her husband, Russell Smith, in a shack in the swamp, not far from the Monroes. Smith would have been 30 at the time of the murder. The woman said that Smith was a terrible husband. He refused to get a job, and he went out every night, usually with a different woman. On the night of the murder, he went out as usual. When he came home, he was very nervous, and he kept washing his hands. The woman assumed that Smith had killed the couple because that's what he told her. Apparently, Smith had assumed that he had killed Arthur, and he had not realized he was alive when he left the farm. The woman also said that at the time, they were poor, so she couldn't afford to buy a newspaper. She just believed whatever her husband told her, and for the past 5.5 decades, she assumed he had killed the couple. She also thought that someone else had been arrested and went to prison for the crime. The police did have 2 suspects, but no one was ever arrested for the crime. Russell Smith was not a suspect in the original investigation. The woman was asked why she took so long to go to the police about what her husband did. She said that Smith had threatened to kill her and their children. The woman said that they ended up getting divorced after 10 years of marriage. When the woman went to the police in 1980, it was too late to charge Russell Smith with any crimes. He had died 4 years earlier in Texas. After the woman came forward, the Michigan State Police felt confident closing the case after 54 years. Number 2. Susan Kilmer. Rhinebeck is a small village in New York's Hudson Valley. In the 1970s, the town had about 2,300 residents. In the summer of 1977, one of those residents was 14-year-old Susan Kilmer. She lived on Cedar Drive, which is a quiet street in the village. She lived with her parents, her brother, and her sister. Although Susan was 14, she liked to act like she was older. She smoked cigarettes, wore makeup, and hung out with kids who were older than her. On July 6, 1977, Susan and a friend hitchhiked to nearby Poughkeepsie. One of their friends was in the hospital, and they paid them a visit. Then they went to the main mall in downtown Poughkeepsie. Susan's friend needed to pick up a pair of glasses from an optometrist's office that was in the mall. But when they got to the office, they found out that the glasses were not yet ready. So at about 3:45 p.m., Susan and her friend split up. That evening, Susan didn't come home. Her parents were frantic, and at about 10 p.m., they reported her missing. The next morning, some kids were walking on a country road just outside of Rhinebeck. At the bottom of an embankment, they saw something odd. It turned out to be the body of 14-year-old Susan Kilmer. She was partially clad, and she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had been beaten to death with 2 rocks. Both blood-covered rocks were found near her body. Blood tests were done, and 2 different blood types were found on the rocks. One was type O, which was Susan's blood type. The other blood type was type A. The police concluded that the type A blood was the killer's blood. Although Susan was partially undressed, she had not been sexually assaulted. The police suspected that the killer had a vehicle and offered Susan a ride home, where he picked her up while she was hitchhiking. Susan's family was shocked and deeply saddened by her brutal murder. Susan's parents suspected that Susan knew her killer. They did not think she would get into a car alone with a stranger. But Susan's siblings did not think that was true. They thought that Susan was bold and a bit adventurous. They thought she could have been hitchhiking home from the mall and then got into her killer's vehicle. A massive investigation was launched. In the 10 days after Susan's body was found, 18 investigators were working 14 hours a day on it. They interviewed over 400 people, but unfortunately, no arrests were made. It wasn't long before the case went cold. The murder was incredibly tough on the Kilmer family. Susan's parents ended up getting divorced. After 4 or 5 years, Susan's family assumed that the case would never be solved. They thought that the only chance it might be solved is if the killer committed a similar murder and he was arrested for that crime, and then the police connected the murders. The police had not lost hope that the case could be solved. In 1986, a state trooper named John Cordell sent the details of the murder to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and asked for assistance. The Behavioral Science Unit sent him a profile of the killer. The profile said that the killer probably had the emotional intelligence of someone in their teens or early 20s, but he was older. The killer probably drank alcohol before the murder. The killer's car was probably old and poorly maintained. The area where Susan was killed was probably familiar to him. He was unmarried and he lived with someone who he was financially dependent on. If he did have a job, it would be a menial job, and he probably didn't have much contact with the public. He was most likely introverted and had very little social skills. This would be especially true when dealing with females. He had probably been rejected by females in the past. He had possibly been rejected because he was overweight or had bad acne. Because of his failure with the opposite sex, he probably had low self-esteem. Since he had low self-esteem, he probably dressed slovenly and he didn't have a regular grooming routine. His education level was high school graduate or lower. He probably didn't have a criminal record, but if he did, the charges would be alcohol related, like driving under the influence. If he were questioned about the murder, he would cooperate. After getting the profile, several investigators on the case read it, but it did not lead to an immediate arrest. The next year, on September 25, 1987, the police were called to a home in Milan, New York. Milan is a town about 7 miles from Rhinebeck. They were called to the home by a 38-year-old man named Joseph Martin. Martin lived at the home with his parents. Joseph claimed that he went out to the grocery store, and when he came home, he found his 84-year-old father, Ralph Martin, dead in the backyard. Ralph had been shot once in the head with a shotgun. Joseph initially said that his father died by suicide, but the police investigating the crime scene said that the evidence didn't indicate that he had died by his own hand. When Joseph was confronted with this evidence, he changed his story. Joseph claimed that his father was a seriously ill man and he was in a lot of pain. Joseph said his father asked him to kill him to put him out of his misery. Joseph said he killed his father out of mercy. The police checked Ralph's health records and learned that the worst he was suffering from was arthritis in his left leg. Then a senior investigator with the state police named Thomas Selman was brought in to give Joseph a polygraph exam. Salmon had been one of the investigators on Susan Kilmer's case, and he read the FBI's profile on the killer. He immediately saw a lot of similarities between the profile from the Behavioral Science Unit and Joseph Martin. It turned out that before Salmon became a state trooper, he worked in construction. He had worked with Joseph on several jobs. Salmon knew that Joseph dressed slovenly and usually wore stained clothes. He often wore high tops without laces. His belly hung over his pants, and he shaved every so often. When he did shave, it was rushed, and something like his sideburns would be uneven. Joseph had never graduated from high school, and he only held menial jobs. He had never gotten married, and he lived with his parents. Joseph did have a few criminal charges, and they all happened when he was drunk. This included being arrested for drinking and driving. Another time, he made obscene gestures to a woman who was a neighbor of his parents. He was drunk when it happened. Joseph had also been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent time in a psychiatric hospital. Something else Salmon noted was that Joseph had type A blood, which was the killer's blood type. Also, not long after the murder of Susan, the police received a tip that Joseph committed the murder. Joseph was questioned by the state trooper, and the state trooper drove him by the crime scene. Joseph denied committing the murder, and he did not react when they drove by the crime scene. The state trooper also talked to his friends and family. One of them supplied Joseph with an alibi for the afternoon of the murder, so he was ruled out as a suspect. In November 1987, Joseph Martin was charged with the murder of his father, Ralph Martin. The district attorney said that Joseph killed his father to get his inheritance. The senior investigator who thought that Joseph killed Susan got in contact with another state trooper named Dennis McGuire. Over 10 years earlier, in July 1976, Joseph Martin was in a serious car accident. Joseph had been thrown from his vehicle, and when McGuire arrived at the crime scene, he found Joseph unconscious and he wasn't breathing. McGuire performed CPR on Joseph, and he ultimately saved his life. McGuire was also the state trooper who questioned Joseph after Susan's murder and drove him past the spot where she had been killed. First, Joseph was questioned about Susan's murder by a detective he didn't know. He was visibly shaken that he was being questioned about the murder. He denied having anything to do with Susan's murder. Then Dennis McGuire came in, and he asked for Joseph to tell the truth about what happened to Susan Kilmer. Joseph said he wanted to talk about the murder because it had been on his mind, and it felt like a pressure in his head. In July 1977, when Susan was killed, Joseph was 30 years old. He said that at about 3 p.m. on the day of the murder, he left his job at a pie factory and he picked up some beer at a local deli. He planned on driving to an area near the Hudson River to drink the beers. Along the way, he came across Susan. Joseph said that he already knew Susan. He claimed that they had met weeks earlier and they had sex. He said that Susan recognized his car and she waved him down. She got into his car and he started driving. He ended up in the area where her body was found and he got her into the back seat. He tried to undress her, but she rejected his advances. He became angry, so he started punching her and then he pushed her out of the car. He started beating her with one of the rocks and then he noticed he cut himself. This made him angry, so he got the bigger rock and he used it to finish Susan off. In February 1988, 10.5 years after Susan Kilmer's murder, Joseph Martin was charged with second-degree murder regarding her death. Since Joseph had a history of mental illness, he underwent several psychological examinations. In April 1988, he was deemed unfit to stand trial. But then, 3 weeks later, that decision was reversed and he was ordered to stand trial for all 3 murders. In October 1988, Joseph Martin pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter regarding the deaths of Susan Kilmer and his father, Ralph Martin. He was expected to be sentenced to 10.5 years to 31 years in prison. But then the judge postponed his sentencing trial indefinitely because he was deemed mentally unfit. It turned out that, besides schizophrenia, Joseph had dementia, possibly from his alcoholism. Joseph Martin was then placed in a state psychiatric hospital. In 1990, he was still considered too mentally ill to be sentenced, and he was to remain in the psychiatric hospital. Joseph Martin's current whereabouts are unknown. If he is alive, at the time of this video, he is 73 years old. Number 1. Nancy Parker. Darrell Parker grew up in Iowa, and he attended the School of Forestry at the Iowa State University. During his second year, he went on a blind date with a young woman named Nancy Morrison. She was also attending the university, and she was a year behind him. They continued to date, and when Darrell was in his final year, he proposed. They were married in March 1954. In November 1954, Darrell moved to Lincoln, Nebraska because he got a job as a city forester. Nancy continued to go to school. Nancy finished her schooling in the spring of 1955, and then she joined her husband in Lincoln. A perk of Darrell's job was that they were given a house to live in. The house was in an isolated area in one of the city's parks. After moving to Lincoln, Nancy got a job as a dietitian at a local flour mill. She and another woman created recipes for the products that the mill sold. The recipes were then printed and attached to the products. Nancy was also hired to do a cooking show on the local television station. Darrell and Nancy felt incredibly fortunate for their good luck in life. They wondered if something terrible was going to happen to level everything out. On the night of November 13th, 1955, someone broke into their home. Not much had been stolen because the couple did not have much to steal. After the break-in, Darrell's boss had a team build a security fence around the house. A month later, on the night of December 13th, Darrell wrapped presents and Nancy wrote out Christmas cards. The next morning, Darrell left for work shortly after 7 a.m. He left Nancy home alone. She had planned on going to the post office to mail 2 packages and the Christmas cards later that morning. At lunchtime, Darrell went home. The documentary starts off with the discovery of a bloated, unidentified body floating in a river. He looked in the master bedroom and he saw Nancy lying in bed. She was under a quilt and a pillow was over her face. Darrell immediately sensed that something was wrong. He went to the bed and he removed the pillow. It was clear that his 22-year-old wife, Nancy, was dead. She had been beaten in the face. A length of twine and a length of clothesline rope were wrapped around her throat. She was nude under the quilt. Twine had also been used to bind her arms behind her back. Darrell immediately called the police and they arrived several minutes later. An autopsy was performed at the local hospital. 4 handkerchiefs had been stuffed in Nancy's mouth. She had a broken nose and a black eye. The cause of death was strangulation. Before she died, she had been raped. The day after the murder, Darrell was asked to look around the house to see if anything was missing. The contents of Nancy's purse had been dumped out. Daryl thought that Nancy had $10 and that was missing. At the time, Daryl was on sedatives and he wasn't totally aware of his surroundings. It turned out that a suitcase that had been monogrammed with Nancy's initials was also missing. But Daryl didn't notice that the suitcase was missing. Instead, someone else who went through the house at a later date and knew Nancy owned the suitcase noticed that it was gone. The murder was big news in Lincoln. A witness reported seeing a dirty 1949 or 1950 black two-door Ford parked near the Parkers' home on the morning of the murder. The police learned that an ex-convict who lived in the area drove a car that matched the description. He was questioned and he took 2 polygraph exams. He passed the exams and he was eliminated as a suspect. A detective who worked on the case, who had been an FBI agent, had a feeling that the killer was Nancy's husband, Daryl. He pointed out that both the twine and the clothesline rope used to bind and kill Nancy and the 4 handkerchiefs that were stuffed in her mouth all belonged to the Parkers. Usually, killers bring their own weapons with them to the crime scene. After Nancy was buried, the police asked Daryl to come in for questioning, and he voluntarily came to the police station. The Lincoln police brought in a criminologist from Chicago, Illinois, named John Reed, to question Daryl. Reed was a former police officer and a polygraph expert. Reed had developed a reputation as someone who could get people to confess to crimes. Unlike many other interrogators of the time, Reed didn't brutalize the people he questioned. Instead, he used psychology to get people to confess. When Reed interviewed Daryl, he hooked him up to a polygraph machine. He then started asking Daryl questions about his wife's murder. No matter what the polygraph machine indicated, Reed told Daryl that he was lying. Reed then explained to Daryl what he thought happened. Reed said he thought that Daryl and Nancy had a bad marriage. He said that Nancy withheld sex from him but flirted with other men. Daryl simply snapped and then raped and killed his wife. Reed also told him that if he didn't confess, he'd fry in the electric chair. The interrogation lasted for 9 hours. Daryl eventually confessed and then signed the confession. On December 22, 1955, 8 days after Nancy was killed, Daryl was charged with first-degree murder. The next day, Daryl recanted his confession. Daryl claimed he was exhausted and emotionally drained, and Reed kept browbeating him. Daryl said that the way Reed questioned him made him feel like he was being hypnotized. Although Daryl recanted his confession, the damage was already done. In April 1956, Daryl went to trial for the murder of his wife. The only evidence against him was the confession. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. The case helped launch John E. Reed's career as one of the foremost experts in interrogation. He eventually developed a method of interrogation called the Reed technique. It starts off with an interview to get a baseline read of a subject. During the interview, the interrogator asks the subject some non-threatening questions. Then the interrogator asks more loaded questions, like we're examining the evidence right now. Is there any reason your DNA might be on any of it? Based on this initial interview, the interrogator must determine if the subject is being truthful. According to the Reed technique, the best way to do this is through nonverbal cues. For example, does the subject appear to be anxious? Are they avoiding eye contact? Is one of their legs bouncing? If the interrogator determines that the subject is lying, they move on to the next phase, which is called the interrogation. The interrogator may leave the room for a few minutes and then come back in with something like a file folder. The initial phase involved a lot of questions, whereas the interrogation phase is more of a monologue by the interrogator. The interrogator may say, "We know you did this, and now we'll see what we can do about it." The interrogator shouldn't give the subject a chance to deny. Instead, the interrogator should give the subject alternatives, which allows them to save face, or minimize, or rationalize their role in the crime. If the subject does admit to something, then the interrogator should congratulate them for being honest and owning up to what they did. Then the interrogator works with the subject to create a full confession. The Reed Technique Manual was first published in 1962. Reed also established his own consulting firm, Johnny Reed & Associates Incorporated. In 1974, they started training law enforcement agencies. This includes police officers, ATF, FBI, and CIA agents, and members of the Secret Service, just to name a few. The Reed technique is still in use today by police forces around the world. As Daryl Parker sat in prison, he continued to proclaim his innocence. But then, in August 1969, over 13 years after he was convicted, his conviction was set aside because of an appeal. A judge ruled that Daryl's confession had been coerced. The judge ordered the state to give Daryl a new trial or release him. The district attorney planned on retrying him. In December 1969, Daryl was released from prison to await his new trial. In July 1970, a deal was made so that Daryl wouldn't have to go to trial again. Instead, he accepted a sentence of 25 to 45 years in prison. He would be paroled instead of going back to prison. After Daryl finished his parole, he moved to Moline, Illinois. He got a job as the superintendent of the parks, and he also got remarried. When people examined Daryl's case, even back in the 1960s, they saw a problem with the Reed technique, and that is, it can lead to false confessions. 30% of people who have been exonerated because of DNA evidence were convicted based on false confessions. In 2012, a Canadian judge said, stripped to its bare essentials, the Reed technique is a guilt-presumptive, confrontational, psychologically manipulative procedure whose purpose is to extract a confession. A significant problem is that the technique is based on determining if someone is being truthful or not. Over the past 3 decades, research has consistently shown that people, even veteran law enforcement agents, cannot determine who is lying. They are about as accurate as someone guessing the outcome of a coin flip. In fact, sometimes the police are worse at predicting when someone is lying than people in other lines of work because they feel more confident in their abilities. A major flaw in the Reed technique is that interrogators are told to look for nonverbal clues, like if the subject is acting anxious. But research has shown there is no correlation between anxiety and lying. Some people may just be anxious because they are being questioned by the police. Other times, someone will act calm, look a police officer in the eye, and tell a series of lies. Despite the criticism, Johnny Reed & Associates still train more interrogators than any other organization in the world. Johnny Reed died in 1982. He died before finding out what happened in the case that made him famous. The identity of Nancy Parker's killer would not be made public until December 1988, 33 years after her murder. On July 3, 1988, a 63-year-old death row inmate named Wesley Peary died of a heart attack. Peary was on death row for the June 1975 murder of a 51-year-old woman named Marion Monroe. Mintzner was bound and shot to death with a .22 caliber handgun when the coin shop she operated in Lincoln was robbed. Peary initially became a suspect because he had a lengthy criminal record. In fact, Wesley Peary had been an early suspect in the murder of Nancy Parker. He knew where the Parkers lived because he was part of the crew that built the security fence. He was also the ex-convict who drove the Ford that was questioned by the police before Darryl was arrested. He was ruled out as a suspect because he underwent 2 polygraph exams. But it turned out that before he took the polygraph exam, he took a tranquilizer, which would have affected the results. Also, the 2 officers who gave him the polygraph exam were not experts in polygraph exams. Sometime after Nancy's murder, Peary was convicted of rape and he was imprisoned at the Nebraska State Prison. His fellow inmate was Darryl Parker. Supposedly, Peary told Darryl that if he paid him, he would reveal who killed his wife. Peary also said he would reveal the location of the stolen suitcase. When Darryl initially looked around the house after the murder, he didn't realize that the suitcase had been stolen. But it was later confirmed that the suitcase had gone missing around the time of the murder. While Peary was on death row for the murder of Marion Monroe, he met with 2 lawyers on 3 different occasions. Once in 1978, another time in 1979, and then again in 1980. During the meetings, Peary said that in addition to killing Monroe, he killed 12 people in 6 different states. He told the lawyers that they could not reveal the details of his confessions until after his death. Since they were bound by client-attorney privilege, they couldn't tell anyone about the confession until Peary died. One of the murders that Peary confessed to was the murder of Nancy Parker. Peary was able to draw the layout of the house, including where the furniture was located. He was also able to describe a birthmark that Nancy had on her chest. Finally, he said he stole Nancy's watch and he pawned it. The fact that Nancy's watch was stolen had never been made public. Another one of the 12 murders that Peary confessed to happened in April 1954 while Peary was in prison serving a burglary charge. He and another inmate attacked a 7-year-old prison guard, John M. Clausen, in the prison's printing plant. Clausen was struck on the head with the leg of a chair, and then his throat was slit with a pocket knife that he carried. The other murders that Peary confessed to could not be verified, and it's believed he lied about them. In 1988, after Wesley Peary's confessions were made public, it closed a cold case that not many people realized was cold. Of course, Darryl Parker and the people who didn't believe he killed Nancy knew that the case was cold. In 1991, Darryl was granted a full pardon. 20 years later, Darryl's lawyer filed a claim asking for $500,000 for the 13.5 years Darryl spent in prison. A year later, in August 2012, the Attorney General of Nebraska apologized to Darryl. Darryl was also granted a declaration of innocence and he was awarded $500,000. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and please don't forget to check out the latest video from Chapter Dark, which is the channel I started with the creator of Top 5 Unknowns. In this week's mystery, a couple has been murdered in their home. Can you figure out who did it? You can find a link to Chapter Dark in the description box. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos just like it. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.